And if you think about how colonialism has impacted Ecuador's economic stability because of the extraction of petroleum, Canadian and US mining companies, you can understand to the root how obviously people are gonna migrate when they're feeling unsafe, when they're feeling not economically stable, because those funds that are from their land, from our land, being taken away by US and Canadian mining companies, and they're displacing indigenous people, indigenous lands, and all of that creates more chaos within the country. And of course, crime, other things are gonna follow. But when we don't think about the root of the cause, which is colonialism, which is that environmental destruction, you just see crime and you're like, oh yeah, that's why people migrate. Like, why can't they go back to their countries and make it great? It's like, no, this country mined my country for generations and created such an unstable reality economically and socially that people had to migrate. Within the violence that we're seeing every day, you have to look for places of hope. Look for the big wins in other places if you don't have them right now in your local space. Like, look for those wins and then remind yourself that you're gonna get a win too, and that other people in this movement and this resistance have gotten wins before too. So we will. Within all your comfort levels, just take the first step. You slowly build up.
Welcome to another episode of the Environment in Canada podcast, a podcast about the environment in Canada and sometimes elsewhere by Sierra Club Canada. I'm Conor Curtis, Head of Communications with Sierra Club Canada, and I'm actually not going to be your host today. Your host today is Kassie Drodge, who did this really great interview about individual action versus community action to address issues like climate change and extractivism, as well as migration and finding hope in movement. Before I hand things over to Kassie, just a reminder that you can take action on environmental issues by visiting sierraclub.ca. We have tons of petitions, other actions and events, and regular news updates you can sign up for on the homepage. You can also find Sierra Club Canada on social media, and you can listen to the Environment in Canada podcast on the Harbinger Media Network, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, iHeartRadio, and YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts. This podcast also airs on CKUT Broadcast Radio in Montreal, 90.3 FM bi-weekly on Tuesdays at 11 a.m. Eastern Time. Don't forget to click follow or subscribe to get the latest episodes from us.
Hi, everyone. My name is Kassie Drodge, and I am the Bay du Nord organizer for Sierra Club Canada. And today I have with me Dome Lombeida. And Dome is a migrant from Ecuador who has been doing work in community with different groups in St. John's for years. Welcome, Dome, and thank you for being here today.
Thank you for having me, Kassie.
As we chat on this rainy but warm day, I must ask you, what made you first decide to go from caring to doing?
That is a convoluted question. I think since I was really little, I was really passionate about the environment. I was in high school called the trash girl. I don't identify as a girl anymore, so that's fine. Because I collected trash from recyclables, and I exhausted myself getting people to give me their like plastic water bottles after they finished them, and I would usually take them back home and get my parents to like recycle them, and it was like kind of like my whole life was about that and about recycling. And I think moving and migrating to Canada and becoming familiarizing myself with being in a different country, and I also did my studies in geography. One of the horrible big things that geography teaches you is how much individualism is not necessarily doing anything, right? Within environmentalism, it's a really easy trap to get to thinking that your actions and you by yourself is so like impactful. And I had such a high moral standard of how I was living, and in a way that I was a vegan, and I was really strict about the amount of trash that I would consume, and I still till this day refuse to learn how to drive because I got caught into the idea that I was never gonna be a driver and use and support the oil and gas industry. But then through teachings and learnings and education, I learned how little I was doing actually by myself and just by my own actions and my own consumption and my own things. And I mean, we read this book called, actually don't remember what the book was called, but it was about recycling and about how like the reality of recycling and like how much energy and consumption it requires, but they don't actually recycle anything, right? And like the best recycled thing is glass. And it's useless to recycle it because it's not that bad for the environment to have glass out there. It acts itself as rocks and it erodes itself like eventually. So that's a very long way of saying that I kind of like having the big realization of how little my impact as a human being was doing made me really want to start acting, and instead of just caring about the environment, I also wanted to start like acting and doing and being involved in community and trying to not just be by myself doing my what I called my moral standards for myself. Like I also think that we should be charging corporations for their environmental disasters. We should be thinking about what other examples I have. I know I have big examples, but
Yeah,
like
they're great examples though.
oil and gas projects that are like gonna continue, like not just from the past but in the future continue to like have environmental impacts and human impacts to people living in the land. So yeah,
Domi,
what's
it
happening?
seems like you really have transformed your way of approaching environmental and community concerns. It seems like you brought it out from the individual, from those days where, you were called the quote unquote trash girl, although, shout out to those names, and, they can be powerful in themselves, although you don't identify as a girl anymore. I think that the story still resonates with a lot of folks who might be trying to start something in their schools. And your journey into creating, a broader approach to how you want to deal with environmental and community concerns, I think resonates with myself and probably some other listeners who are just joining on the call or have been listening to your story now. But I think that one of the biggest problems is actually trying to find out what works best. And I think you bring a really interesting point into the conversation about initiatives around recycling and initiatives around conservation. What are the most impactful initiatives at hand? What can we do to actually see them work in the community, and how can we track and measure to make sure that these things are actually making the differences that we want to see? You're also pointing to a very interesting, like, think globally, but like act locally perspective, which I think is more important now than ever in the energy and environmental movements that we've seen like in Canada and even internationally. So I had to ask, because you've been mentioning so many important causes and initiatives that you've been a part of from a very young age up until now. With all these important causes out there, what makes this one special to you? And I guess this one, as in oil and gas, environmental sustainability, industry accountability. I'll just let you run with that.
Industry accountability. Oh God. So I think there's something here about how our sole purpose as human beings ends up being wrapped up with capitalist ideas, that I think this cause to me is really important and impactful, because we are not just fighting for the environment. We're not just fighting for corporations to actually be accountable to the damage that they're doing for profit. We're we're not just fighting for protection of land. We're also fighting against capitalism, against colonialism, against what has historically been portrayed as economic growth that ends up harming, displacing, and creating destruction in our world. And I think, I don't know, I guess it's difficult to talk about environmentalism without thinking about indigenous rights and indigenous land protection, and without thinking about colonialism and like its broader impact within our humanity and our collective consciousness. And like we were meant to be people working 9 to 5s doing this. This is the cause of actually, I guess I'm thinking of cause as colonialism, or as actively fighting colonialism, because I think that's what we're doing when we're thinking about environmentalism, and I think that's what we should be doing. I don't know if other environmentalism thinks that way or talks that way, but I think what the cause is doing is fighting against colonialism, because that is what has been causing the displacement of land, what has been the resource extraction of land, and I can't even begin to talk about how this, like, something that I hold very dear, and it's really hard to me, is the resource extraction that's happened to my country. I'm from Ecuador, for years, for generations, due to colonialism. It's post-colonial. We call it post-colonialism, right? But it's, if you think about, so a cause that I'm very passionate about because I'm a migrant is immigrant rights. And if you think about how colonialism has impacted Ecuador's economic stability because of the extraction of petroleum, Canadian and U.S. Mining companies, you can understand to the root how obviously people are gonna migrate when they're feeling unsafe, when they're feeling not economically stable, because those funds that are from their land, from our land, being taken away by U.S. and Canadian mining companies, and they're displacing indigenous people, indigenous lands, and all of that creates more chaos within the country, and of course, crime, other things are gonna follow. But when we don't think about the root of the cause, which is colonialism, which is that environmental destruction, you just see crime and you're like, oh yeah, that's why people migrate. Like, why can't they go back to their countries and make it great? It's like, no, this country my country for generations, and created such an unstable reality economically and socially that people had to migrate. Anyways, that was a very convoluted way of saying why this cause is really important to me, but I think to me, it's finding that root and understanding that root also helps you understand so many other problems outside of just outside of environmental destruction and extinctions and other things. It's just natural resources that are extracted with no permission and no say on how people who have lived in that land, have owned that land, have lived in that land for generations, are gonna feel about those resource extraction, about that resource extraction. So yeah, okay,
That's a very powerful story, Dome, and I think you touched on a lot of really relevant points that we can learn from here, especially in Newfoundland and Labrador, Canada. And I want to just take a moment to pinpoint that time in your country in Ecuador. And I know that we come from a very different generation, like millennial, Gen Z. And you said that this thing, in terms of resource extraction and industry kind of bulldozing over communities' wants and needs, this has been happening for generations. And so I guess just out of curiosity, if you were there at the beginning of all this, what would you do differently, or what would you want these industries to do differently, just in hindsight of, let's say 30 years going forward?
If I was there at the beginning?
Yeah. And you know what you know now. So 30 years later, let's say this started happening in 1995. What would
God,
you have said?
resist. Resist the urge of coming and colonizing my country. I think a lot of colonialism is presented as it's gonna be so great, so good for your community, so impactful, but it hasn't, and it never has, and I'm actually sure that my people resisted this. I have it in my soul that people resisted this. But it's really hard because with resistance comes sometimes violence, because also we have to be violent back, because if they're coming in and having environmental destruction. I think yeah, I think resisting. I think resistance is the biggest thing that you can do, and resistance is difficult if you do it alone. And I know that the indigenous communities in my country united to resist this. And there's 13 indigenous communities in Ecuador, in so-called Ecuador, because it was also colonized. And I can't talk about my land without talking about the fact that it like I am a generation of settlers, and it was in Latin America we use the term mestizo, where we know that there is indigenous ancestry in us, but we are not sure where it comes from. But it also comes with convoluted other ways of seeing race and colorism within our country that don't actually let people talk about racism and see racism for what it is. But that's a separate topic. But I think community building is so important, and I know that, for example, there was recently in 2021 there was a big resistance movement in Ecuador where the oil prices ended up. I'm not sure how to explain the story very well, but there was a resistance from our indigenous community in Ecuador, and there was a huge walk of people over 3 days, of indigenous communities walking over 3 days and to fight against this oil increase that was going to affect their communities even more. So I see it. I see that there's resistance right now. So I know that there was resistance back then. And it also hurts because I mean, I am who I am because of colonialism. Because somebody. Anyways, sorry. I'm getting
No,
distracted with the original question. But
I think you're pointing to a really interesting point about how colonialism changes both humans and nature, and which is something that we don't really talk about. And I think that a lot of the times we, both in even Ecuador and Canada, often think that, okay, these are the cards that we're dealt. This is the life that we're supposed to live. And everything that happens to us is out of our control. So we should do nothing about it, or there's nothing that we can do about it. And I think that that type of conversation needs to continue to happen. And I think what you're talking about, especially in terms of white settlerism and acknowledging past, whether you're connected to indigenous communities or not, it's really important to acknowledge that, the land was there before, people were there before, and there were unifying either reasons or unifying events that happened that really brought folks together. And colonialism does create binaries in nature and in humans itself, which is a socialization process. But I think that it's still related to environmentalism and energy, because oftentimes we are caught up in who's left behind, who's included, and what's at risk, who's at risk. And that's super important to continue having in these conversations. And these questions are definitely relevant to, I think, communities and as well as policymakers. And as you were talking about Ecuador, I just looked it up very quickly, and there's a lot of resistance happening there in terms of rights of nature, opposition to oil, anti-mining resistance. And I'm just looking right now at case study in Los Cedros.
Yeah.
Cedros. Okay, Los Cedros and the mining threats. So it seems like in the last few years, very similar to what you were talking about, a lot of groups have gotten together and they've focused on the tropical Andes. Biologic Andes, hotspot, and they are concerned about the endangered species that are currently being threatened by the mining industry. They're also saying that, there's reservations around national parks, rich agricultural lands, which are very culturally distinct for people, and offer a wide range of fruits and vegetables and flowers. And I think that connection right there between people and what the land can offer is something that these industries try to separate and cover up there. So I do really appreciate that perspective. And I think that while this might be a Canadian-based podcast, you don't know who's out there, who's migrated, whether they're an environmental refugee, which is something we need to consider a lot more going forward, or whether they're just here because they want to be. Mm-hmm. I think that your story and these stories are important and relevant in this context as we move forward in 2025.
Yeah, I mean, there was this huge oil spill recently, in May, in this big part of this province in Esmeraldas. and it has caused so much displacement, and itself it affects, like, you don't really think about it, but like the environmental racism that exists within the country, because Esmeraldas is one of the provinces in Ecuador with the highest percentage of Black people, and that is not a coincidence. That's
Yeah.
it's never a coincidence that they put mining, that they drill oil in particularly places where there's higher racialized people, and like it was the highest. It's like 70% of the population in Esmeraldas is Afro descendant, and if you think about it more, the people who are even most affected by this oil spill are the women and children who were using the land to extract shellfish and mussels, and that because the spill it was in a mangrove area, and that's how people would use the land, is to take mussels and like eat them, and so that was and fishing also, and so I can't even imagine the huge impact that has on the mangrove forest, and which people are dependent on. Yeah, it's really sad, and it really makes me think, about like all the huge migration that we're going to see, not just through environmental disaster, but also like the generational effects of losing access to your land, that also has on people and on your mental health and other things, right? Like we see it here. We know what intergenerational trauma looks like, and we're going to continue seeing it. And that's it's unfortunate. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. I can see a lot of similarities, and I'm glad you were able to make that connection as well. Just drawing it back from Ecuador to even Canada, or so-called Canada, and Newfoundland and Labrador. I think that oftentimes a lot of extractive resource projects find themselves trying to settle in very marginalized communities, whether it's highly racialized communities, so communities with a lot of Black, Indigenous, migrant individuals, whether it's been economically deprived place. So more broadly, which I think you were talking about, which was like the cod collapse. So trying to find places that have suffered like economic and environmental degradation, and cannot necessarily seem to find a replacement or resilient way forward that would seemingly support communities in their growth. And obviously, jobs are at the forefront of a lot of these conversations as well. And so I think that you're talking like about a vicious circle, like this is happening. Like, we need jobs to live, we need energy to supply our communities, but we don't want to do it in a way that takes away land piece by piece. We don't want, and correct me if I'm wrong, we don't want an industry that's just going to take land and water and make it unusable, make it inaccessible, whether it's through pollution or just taking it in terms of ownership. I think that there is a commonality between how industry, specifically oil and gas and mining, take control of vulnerable towns and vulnerable communities. And so I think that it's still a conversation we need to keep having, and it needs to keep happening. And it reminds me, especially with the mussels, the Bay du Nord project specifically talks about in their environment impact assessment how blasting for oil, because it's deep sea drilling, it will actually affect the shellfish and some of the surrounding sea life. So outside of the environment impact assessment, we're not necessarily looking at the practical community risks that come from, okay, we don't have mussels, or if we have mussels, they, are covered in oil, which in turn will affect how, the quality of food for folks. It will affect the availability of food. And I know just from having fisher family that, mussels and shrimp, they are the cleaners of the ocean. They do filter out a lot of the things that we don't need. And so if we're just going to keep piling on, projects and projects that are going to be taking away their homes or going to be adding more pollution to their own environments, we're definitely not doing ourselves a favor. And I think you're right. Women and children are definitely at the forefront of food scarcity and just nutritional risk in terms of consuming microplastics, polluted food. I really appreciate this. And I think that a lot of people resonate with that now, so more than maybe even 15 or 20 years ago. So just switching the dials. I know we're talking about so many, really hard and very important, but very hard topics. But there has to be something good that comes out of this. There has to be something that drives you to, show up every day. So what makes this work rewarding for you, Dome?
That is a difficult question because of the current political climate that we're living in. And I think the thing that does keep me going is the people and the community that we've built. I think it's indispensable how people are going to show up for community and for you. And community care is like incredibly important to the system that we live in right now. I think individualism and kind of finding myself, if I end up finding myself in a way that I'm like, no, but I have to do this and I have to do that and I have to do this, like you don't have to live your life thinking that way, and you don't have to live your life thinking that there's some sort of price for doing things by yourself and alone. And
Mhm.
to do this work is really hard, and you have to talk through feelings, and you have to talk, and you have to have interpersonal relationships with people, and you have to like build friendships and companionship with people doing this same type of work, because otherwise you're gonna succumb to being demoralized and alone.
Mhm.
And I think, yeah, my community is what keeps me going, and I hold a really special place in my heart for all the love and care that I've gotten from this community and from other activists and other people who work in community, because they know what it's like to do this and get nowhere.
Mhm.
And then you and then you have to get up and stand up and say, no, I'll keep going. And seeing resistance work is incredibly important to keep going. Like I just want to get hope somewhere, and it's like, yes, I see that and I get it. Like we all do. We all want hope. We want people who are actually getting what it's the actually fighting back and getting
Mhm.
it, fighting back and achieving it, and because that makes you think I can keep fighting back, and I can keep resisting, and one day we're gonna get there. And yeah, I think within all the horrible loss that we're living in and the horrible violence that we're seeing on our screens, within the violence that we're seeing every day, you have to look for places of hope. So for example, it's really hard to look for hope in within the genocide in Gaza. Um,
Yeah.
But one way that I look for hope in that is to see how many people are speaking up now that they haven't before. Like think about
Mhm.
like the 75 years of genocide that they were living through, that nobody spoke that nobody, not nobody,
Yeah.
there were people speaking out, there were people resisting, but then now there's more people resisting, now there's more people like advocating against this. Like that is incredibly empowering to see. And even think about the BDS movement, right? Like we've been able to close stores down in McDonald's. We've been able to like decrease their amount of profits,
Mhm.
and we're gonna continue doing that, and we're gonna continue making these companies accountable for their genocidal ideas. And so, yes, look for the big wins in other places if you don't have them right now in your local space. Like look for those wins, and then remind yourself that you're gonna get a win too, and that other people in this movement and this resistance have gotten wins before too. So we will. And
I love that. That is such great advice. Look for wins. When you don't have them in your space, there's always another space that's ready to celebrate and welcome you into their initiative, into their campaign, into their cause, which I think is really powerful, especially as we navigate this world where we're being more critical of borders. We're crossing communication lines across countries. It's been quite, even over the last 5 years, it's been quite eye opening in terms of how we view geography, politics, and how those decision makers actually influence our everyday lives. And I think you gave like really good advice for folks who are listening who are wondering, like, what can I do? How can I sustain myself? But is there any other advice you would give for somebody who's just starting out and who wants to break the shell? They're just getting into the movement.
Okay, so I think it is quite intimidating to get into a movement. I did see myself being really intimidated when I was like starting out, and I remember feeling like so small and so like little, and I was like, I'm not very well acquainted with everything that I'm supposed to know to be able to to participate in the space and to play in this space. And it's like you don't need to be there. Nobody, we don't all need to be there. You have the passion and
Yeah.
and the initiative to want to act up, to want to start be building a movement and to be part of a movement. That's great. Start there. You don't need to be up there. And I still feel like sometimes I'm like, oh, like I'm not that well like acquainted with this knowledge or that knowledge. But then but I because there's always somebody who's gonna know more. And that's the thing is there's always gonna be somebody who knows more. I still like find that and I still do that, but like I no longer feel this sense of shyness and like embarrassment over my part, because your part is already so good, and like your body, your capacity is already building capacity within the movement. So don't feel intimidated about joining. Okay, that's one thing. Now let's say you do want to join a movement. I think I'll bring it back to the source, the community source. Find people who are gonna bring you into the movement and who are gonna walk you through the movement and are gonna take your hand and bring you in and support your growth as you become a part of the movement and become aware of what you are capable of doing and what you are able to do, because sometimes I think we sometimes we want to do too much and then we're burnt out. So I do think finding those connections with people who are already been in the movement maybe for a little bit, maybe for a long time, and letting them take you and guide you inside the movement. And then as you go, as you meet more people, as you build community, you're gonna see what you're good at and what you can participate in and what you can actually do. And I also think, oh my God, there's this idea that like to act and to like want to be more socially aware and want to do something against horrible environmental policies or like our climate politics, that we have to become an activist. And to that, I hope you challenge that. There's so many ways to be part of a movement without being an activist. And like think about like disability movement has a lot of tips and ways that you can actually help within the movement to build capacity in your bed, in a chair, like in your house. There's so many ways you can participate in community aid and be a part of a mutual aid fund and donate to a mutual aid fund, or like talk about mutual aid fund with other people in your community and talk about how mutual aid fund like helps like a specific population that you're thinking of. Like you can like distribute food supplies and food for community organizers, or like you can help people with emails. You can do so much. There's so much that you can do that you are not gonna think is valuable because we have this association of what is being an advocate. And no, there's so many ways to be an advocate. And I hope I love I wish we had a list about this specifically from our context in Canada context, because I saw one recently of within the ice raids context and how people can help like about the within the ice raids when they don't want to like I guess politically put their body in the middle of people, and it had so many great tips of like being a resource knowledge sharer, right? Like learning where to go, or learning what legal help there is to help people out, learning what volunteering opportunities there are within those communities, and for childcare or other types of help, right? So I think within all your comfort levels, just take the first step. I remember when I graduated in 2022, I wrote this huge document of how I was going to become an activist. And it's really funny because I didn't follow any of the track that I like, because I was like, yeah, I'll do this, and I'll do that, and I'll do that, and I'll do that. And it's like, no, I actually just started talking to people, and then I started being like, hey, can I be a part of this? And they're like, okay, yeah, come in. And then like I knew more people, and then suddenly I was like, hey, can I be a part of the board? And that's because I wanted it. But you slowly build up. And yeah.
I love that. Oh my gosh, I feel like that is how to get involved in a movement and raise awareness 101. Come in where you are, your skills are valued, connect with people, find folks who are going to bring you into a movement. Don't negate the fact that there's places where you can learn more, there's places where you can teach. And a lot of the time, activism, raising awareness, and supporting a movement are three different things. And I think that we don't necessarily need to be one of three. We can be three of three, and we can even be more than that. I think that we are what our communities need, and you definitely speak a lot to that, Dome. And I do want to thank you so much for taking the time to be here today on this rainy yet really warm day in St. John's. And again, my name is Kassie Drodge. I'm the Bay du Nord organizer with Sierra Club Canada, and I'm speaking with Dome Lombeida, a migrant from Ecuador who's been doing work in community with different groups in St. John's for a few years, as well as the project manager for the Anti-Racism Coalition of Newfoundland and Labrador's anti-hate campaign. So thank you for being with us here today, Dome, and I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day.
Thank you so much, Kassie.
Before we end today, just a reminder that you can take action on environmental issues by visiting sierraclub.ca. We have tons of petitions, other actions and events, and regular news updates you can sign up for on the homepage. You can also find Sierra Club Canada on social media, and you can listen to the Environment in Canada podcast on the Harbinger Media Network, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, iHeartRadio, and YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts. This podcast also airs on CKUT Broadcast Radio in Montreal 90.3 FM bi-weekly on Tuesdays at 11 a.m. Eastern Time. Don't forget to click follow or subscribe to get the latest episodes from us.